everybody hear me okay? Thanks. Just out of respect for the patrons of the bills, I'd like to allow 2 minutes for each person to talk on either side. If you're representing different groups and you're just going to testify with the same material, maybe you could just introduce yourself and the group that you're with. We would appreciate that. So we've got blocks. We're going to start with the subject matter of photo ID. We do have a sign-up sheet. Delegate Carr, I see that you have House Bill 1953.
Good morning, Madam Chairman. Thank you. House Bill 1953 deals with accepted forms of voter ID, has to do with the valid nursing home IDs. Specifically, the bill adds an identification card that contains a photo of a voter that has been issued by a private entity that is licensed to operate in the state. It's through one of the following departments, whether it's the health, social services, medical assistance services, Department of Behavioral Health, or developmental services. And the voter ID card is added to the list of the ID cards that are valid in order to vote on this bill. The bill is brought to me by constituents who regularly volunteer their times at the polls, and they often find that citizens of nursing homes and other residential care facilities lack regular access, whether it be the transportation or because of a health issue, to the DMV to obtain a state ID. So the bill would allow the resident to use the photo ID provided by the facility of care.
Anyone here to testify in favor of the bill?
Madam Chairwoman. Edgardo Cortez, the Commissioner of Elections. We think this bill would be particularly helpful for individuals that live in nursing homes and other facilities like that. One of the things that we hear from them is that because they no longer drive and they're retired, they don't have access to one of the other forms of acceptable ID. So this is something we've heard from across the state from different constituencies, and we think would be a big help to voters. Thank you.
Morning, Madam Chairman, members. Carol Naga with the League of Women Voters, and we would concur with Mr. Cortez to support this bill.
Anyone here in opposition of the bill?
Chairman, Tracy Howard, President of the Voter Registrars Association of Virginia. We are not opposed to this bill, but there is a question as to which IDs would be validated by our officers of election, i.e. how would the officer of election know that this was a valid identification from one of these entities?
Board Manager, Chairman, Member Clarabelle Wheeler, Vice Chair of the State Electoral Board, speak in opposition to this board. People who are in nursing homes already have IDs. By virtue of the fact that many of them are either on Medicaid or Medicare, they must have a photo ID to participate in those caregiving programs. There is no regulation for individual nursing home facilities. It could be 2 or 3 people in a home. It could be a facility that has 2 or 3,000. But there's no way to regulate who is producing these photo IDs. And again, everyone who is in a nursing home should already have a photo ID, and the Commonwealth provides that for free. Thank you.
Bill Jenkins, a rural registrar from Sussex County, in opposition of this bill. We already have caregivers as an option now, and the nursing homes usually have a coordinator to do it, but we have to know who's, so the people that mail in their ballots from the nursing home, they don't need an ID. And the only one, I've only done one since we put this in, and they came and I gave it, so I think it's just not needed.
Cameron Sassnet, General Registrar for Fairfax County. spoken to somebody who is a assisted living coordinator. I can tell you specifically what we think of most people in nursing homes is not being able to make it to the polls. There are quite a few of them who are just simply in assisted living and do have the ability to make it out to absentee voting or even their polling place on election day. So those folks may not have other forms of ID. They may not have an ID provided. Another agency, but the nursing home itself might be able to provide that ID. So Fairfax County and myself are in favor of this bill.
Madam Chair. I think I heard some testimony that wasn't relevant to what your bill does. I heard that they already have one, an ID, which is the purpose of your bill, so they can use it.
Correct.
Okay. So we don't have any standards. Would you like to address that issue, that there's not a standard between nursing homes? These are all Virginia licensed and regulated facilities. This is not like you're taking care of your grandmother somewhere.
That's correct. That's correct. I don't, I think that, I don't know about you're taking care of your grandmother or 2 or 3 people in a home. I'm not familiar with what kind of certification they would have.
That's because you're allowing people to use their ID from facilities that are licensed by the state of Virginia.
Yes.
I move to report. It's a good bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I apologize. First meeting. Second to PBI the bill. All of those in favor to PBI. Aye.
No.
All right. We're still on photo ID. Delegate Sullivan, House Bill 1462.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. Good morning, members of the committee. House Bill 1462 deals with which photo identifications would be acceptable to vote in Virginia. As you know, we've had photo ID for a while now. And since then, since we first passed this statute, we've been, say, tweaking it, perfecting it a little bit. For instance, several years ago, we added private schools to it, which the General Assembly found to have been an anomaly and oversight in the original legislation. 1462 is a fix of what I believe, at least, is a hole in the statute, but still consistent with what we've been trying to do with photo ID. Just by way of background, I'm sure the committee members know, for instance, that any employer ID is allowed under the statute. Any employer from anywhere. So in my neck of the woods, for instance, if I happen to work in Washington, D.C. for the Acme Brick Company, my Acme Brick photo ID, employer ID, is acceptable. We also, of course, allow student IDs, but there's a provision that says it has to be a Virginia school student IDs. I might add, by the way, that the Virginia requirement, I should say, was added. And while it talks about private schools and universities, and there are lists of universities, of course, you can get, there are thousands and thousands of private schools in Virginia, private and parochial schools. So what is it that 1462 does? 1462 fills a hole in the statute. You can use an employer ID, but you can't use a student ID. For instance, I have 2 IDs to show the committee. This is a student at Georgetown University. His ID simply says Georgetown University student. This ID, let me get a copy of it, I thought I had it here to be smooth here, is a faculty member at Georgetown University. It is the exact same ID, and this is usable. This, by the way, is the father of a student at Georgetown. So this gentleman can use his Georgetown faculty ID It is identical in every respect, except it says faculty, because Georgetown's his employer. The student with an identical ID can't use that ID because they happen to be a student. So if you go to school at Georgetown, you can't use your ID. If you go to school at Marymount, which is about 3 miles away in Arlington, you can use your ID. It seems an anomaly that really doesn't fit the intent of the statute. I have experienced this at the polls. Just this last November, I was working the Madison precinct in Arlington County. A young woman walked in ready to vote. She walked out several minutes later. I said, how'd it go? She said, I couldn't vote. I said, why not? She said, because I go to Southern Methodist University in Texas. She has an SMU photo ID. She showed it to them. It's out of state. She couldn't vote. Now, you say to yourself, well, she must have had a driver's license. Well, the U.S. Department of Agriculture statistics show that only about 68% of 18-year-olds have driver's licenses, particularly in urban parts of the Commonwealth. A lot of these kids don't need driver's licenses or can't afford cars, so they use other forms of ID. So having a student ID was put in there specifically to allow flexibility and give people who might not have some other form of ID an ability to vote. But by limiting it to only schools in the Commonwealth, we're denying a certain part of our electorate the opportunity to vote. I've checked. There are 300 Virginians that go to Duke. There are over 220 Virginians that go to Georgetown. And I'm sure the statistics are similar for universities and colleges all across the country outside of the Commonwealth. So this fills a hole, and to my way of thinking, members of the subcommittee, this is just a fairness issue. Let's let our, say, kids, most of them are kids, meaning under age 22 usually, who go to school, who we send to great universities around the country, let them use their IDs to vote. It's a fairness issue and fills a hole. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Anyone here to speak in favor of the bill?
Edgardo Cortez, Commissioner of Elections, and we support the bill for the reasons stated by the delegate, but we do think it provides some parity for students regardless of where they attend higher education institutions. Thank you.
Good morning. Alicia Smith with Virginia Education Association. We also support this bill for the reasons aforementioned.
Cameron Sasson, General Registrar, Fairfax County. As the delegate stated, we support the bill.
General Registrar, City of Falls Church, David Berkey. We also support the bill.
Bill Jenkins, Registrar of Sussex County. I think if you don't have a ID from a Commonwealth of Virginia college and you don't have an ID that shows you have a driver's license, you just might not be a real resident of Virginia. Lately, in the last few years I've been registrar, we switched. I have a solution. It's a radical solution. The people that are not home, they can vote absentee. You simply mail in an absentee ballot. You have 45 days to do it. Please keep these IDs in state. We have no way to accurately check if we're using out-of-state IDs. Thank you.
Clarabelle Wheeler, Vice Chair of the State Board of Elections. I echo what General Registrar Jenkins has said. People who live in Virginia, particularly college students, who pride themselves on their intellectual capability, certainly ought to be able to read the law. And ignorance of the law is no excuse. The law has a list of accepted photo IDs: driver's license, passport, Virginia student IDs, etc. The Commonwealth will provide free of charge a photo ID for any student who does not have a driver's license in Virginia and is a student in out-of-state colleges. Pretty soon we'll have so many different IDs that it'll be irrelevant and they won't be verifiable. Once again, we go back to the ability to verify the ID that the person is holding. The Commonwealth will provide a free photo ID. I don't see that there's any reason why students should not know that. They know where to vote. They ought to know what their photo ID requirement is. We need Virginia state IDs. Thank you.
Morning. My name is Reagan George. I'm with the Virginia Voters Alliance. I would second what Clarabelle just mentioned. In addition to that, you have poll workers or election officials that are working poll books, and when presented with an ID from Lord knows where, especially from employers, how do they know that that's a valid ID? I could make up an ID with the Poquoson Polytechnic Institute, and that would serve as a possible ID for me as a student. It's absurd. Thank you.
Anyone else to speak in opposition or in favor of this bill in the audience? We have questions for the patron. Motion to PBI. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. All of those in favor of PBI House Bill 1462, please respond by saying aye.
Aye.
All of those opposed?
No.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, we are still on photo ID.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair. Yes, ma'am. Morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I rise in support of House Bill 1904, which ostensibly would repeal the photo ID requirement for voting in Virginia. I would tell you, Madam Chair, that history is a funny thing. Not so terribly long ago, when the Byrd machine ran Virginia, my party, quite effectively and for a long time, maintained its stranglehold on Virginia politics by finding new and creative ways to keep people from voting who were legitimately entitled to vote. It was your party, Madam Chair, that courageously used the Voting Rights Act to find ways to tear down those walls and to change the balance of things in the Commonwealth, and I think for the better. Today, we find ourselves almost back in the same situation, although in reverse. We find impediments to voting rights for no ostensive reason. We can't point to any incident of voter fraud that any registrar, that any member of the Board of Elections, that anyone can point to. I've done, frankly, electoral law for about 20 years in Virginia. I've never seen one either. We know, Madam Chair, that, this bill, there's a lot of concern about what could happen, but the problem is it just never has. This is trying to cure a disease that really doesn't even exist as far as we can tell. And we know, Madam Chair, and we've seen study after study, everybody here knows these issues. The problem with requiring ID falls out very clearly among racial and socioeconomic status. A study as recently as February 15 shows us that 13% of blacks, 10% of Hispanics, but only 5% of whites lack photo ID. We know from the same study that 12% of all adults living in households with less than $25,000 annual income lack ID, where, flipping that, only 2% of adults in households with incomes exceeding $150,000 lack it. We see the same thing with age. Young adults are less likely to have photo IDs, and that's significant. Over 15% of 18 to 20-year-olds, 11% of 21, 24. We all know these numbers. Frankly, Madam Chair, I think we all understand why these bills exist. Unfortunately, I think that there are better ways to administer elections than imposing these additional requirements both on voters and the registrars that administer them. And it's for this reason, Madam Chair, that I am rather proud to carry this administration bill. I do believe that there are speakers on this. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Edgardo Cortez, Commissioner of Elections. We do support this bill. We think we have spent a good amount of resources, both financial resources and otherwise, on implementing a bill, and we continue to spend a lot of resources to maintain a requirement that does not appear to have any lasting benefit or address a issue when we have a lot of other election administration issues that we could be addressing utilizing those same resources. So we do support this bill. Thank you.
Morning. My name is Hope Ameskid. I represent the ACLU of Virginia, and we strongly support this legislation. Thank you.
Morning again, Carol Nagle, the League of Women Voters, and we will support this also.
Julie Emery with the Virginia Civic Engagement Table. We support this legislation as well.
Anyone else to speak in favor of the bill? Opposition?
Madam Chairman, members and guests, I've spent an awful lot of time in the last 10 or 15 years watching elections, participating in elections, working outside the polls, working inside the polls, being an election official, being a Board of Election member, and I can tell you that there are people who will try to vote twice. I have seen people in the polls when Virginia used to have, and they still have, voter registration cards without photos. People have come in to try to vote twice. The law is very clear. It's one vote, one person, period. When someone votes twice, they disenfranchise someone who only votes once. By having a photo ID, which is freely given by the Commonwealth to anyone, it provides that person's access to voting. Every state and Commonwealth that has passed a photo ID requirement has shown an increase in voter participation by ethnic minorities and all racial groups. Let me repeat that. Every state that has a photo ID has shown an increase in voter participation for all people living in that state, no matter of their race, their creed, or ethnic origin. One of my very favorite quotes on photo ID comes from the former mayor of Atlanta, former UN ambassador from the United States, Andrew Young, by no means a conservative or a member of a Republican Party. When Georgia passed the first photo ID, Ambassador Young said, quote, "I would like to thank the legislators of Georgia for giving every citizen of Georgia a photo ID because you cannot participate in mainstream America without one." Thank you, Ambassador Young. Thank you,
I have a
members.
question, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman.
Delegate Sickles?
I'm just curious, when that person was attempting to commit a felony right in front of you, what did you do?
Person ran from the building.
So you didn't call the police?
The person ran from the building and exited the building and was unable to be caught.
Madam Chair. So that was one person, the person?
That was the first time I saw it actually take place in front of me.
But you just know it's happening all the time, and you never call the cops for all those other times?
Well, let's see, there's a case right now in Harrisonburg where people are registering without being people. They're just registering Social Security numbers, to say that there is not voter fraud, I think is not paying attention to what's happening in Virginia and in the country.
I think that you're confusing young people that are getting paid per signature to get people registered with actually voting. I think are you saying those things are the same things?
I'm saying it's voter fraud. It's a different mechanism of action, but it's still voter fraud.
I have a question along those lines. Since we obviously do have voter fraud throughout the state, and there have been cases that have been prosecuted, we had a joint committee hearing in October where we heard testimony of several cases of voter fraud in the Commonwealth. So, to say there's no voter fraud is either being willfully ignorant or just being naive. Since a lot of the fraud is based on the voter list, as you cited, there are pending cases now of people falsifying voter registration. Wouldn't you agree that requiring a photo ID is one way to discourage or to limit the ability of someone who is registered fraudulently from actually being able to go and consummate their crime by actually going out and voting.
I would concur with that unequivocally. It also, having a photo ID also helps the election officer in the precinct on a busy day such as election day in a presidential campaign, when you have thousands of people coming through a polling place. Showing a photo ID helps the election officer make sure that he or she is giving credit to the right person for voting. There are lots of people in Virginia with very similar names, families that all live in the same house and have 5 or 6 people living there with very similar names. If you have a photo ID, it helps the election officer realize it's a man who is an elderly person or someone who is probably the father or grandfather in the family, not the 18-year-old. So when they mark the electronic poll book, they're marking the right name. It's a safeguard for all voters.
Anyone else? We've got a lot of bills that we need to get to, so.
Again, I'm Reagan George with the Virginia Voters Alliance. Several things about no voter fraud. We've found over 1,000 people removed from the voter rolls in 8 counties because of declared non-citizenship status. 85 of those people have voted, and they cast over 250 votes, both in federal and state elections. So it's not only voter fraud, it's felonies. We're after right now getting the entire state's list so that we can identify exactly who it is that has voted. You're talking about photo ID. All you have to do is look south of the border and look at Mexico. They have 86 million people all registered to vote. They have an incredible photo ID system in place. You don't vote without it. India has the same thing. Now, you'd think that the poor in India or the poor in Mexico probably outweigh our poor. And I think that's a bogus argument to say that the poor can't get an ID. It's ridiculous. Thank you.
More questions for the patron? Delegate Fowler.
Just a statement. Photo ID has been around here, for a while in the Commonwealth, and I think just about everybody that I know knows of it, and it's working. Back in Hanover during the last election, I think we had something like 50,000 votes cast, and I checked to see how many folks had cast a provisional ballot, and to my amazement, I think it was like 2 or 3 dozen provisional ballots, out of 50,000 votes cast. So again, I think this is a solution in search of a problem. For that reason, I make a motion to pass the bill by.
Bill is PBI'd. Thank you.
Madam Chair, should I present my bill right here? Or?
Absolutely.
All right. Madam Chairman, as you know, we require folks to have a photo ID to cast a ballot here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Of course, we do not require that for a absentee ballot. And so, again, to me, that seemed like a kind of a hole in the law. And I think with the number of people who vote absentee that we should also require a photo ID for voting absentee. Now, the bill before you, House Bill 1428, would just simply require a person to send in a photo ID with their application. And again, folks, there is folks that are active duty military and or their spouses that are stationed overseas are not required to do that. The bill would also then go on to, require the State Board of Elections upon receiving the application, or again, or a local registrar, I guess, to return with the ballot, an envelope so that when the person casts the absentee ballot, they're going to also, return the ballot with a valid photo ID. And again, they can, of course, use the any of those photo IDs that are listed in the, currently listed in the code. I'm looking through this. Let's see. Again, they also have the opportunity to provide a provisional ballot if something is not correct. If you're voting absentee in person, you still have the same ID protocol. And I guess in a nutshell, that's basically House Bill 1428.
Delegate Fowler. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak in opposition or in favor of this bill?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Edgardo Cortez, the Commissioner of Elections. We do not support this bill. We think it adds a pretty heavy administrative burden to our registrars in conducting an election. And based on the discussion you all have had this morning about photo ID and the sense that you've all indicated makes it more secure when people go in person, there's something to compare it to. You're missing that component of it when you do it by sending in something by mail. So from that regard, we think there are probably better ways to address it, like providing more access to absentee voting in person, where you would have that face-to-face contact, to show that identification. So because of that heavy burden, we are not supporting this bill. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Carol Nago with the League of Women Voters, and we would not support this bill either. For one thing, you can request that absentee ballot online, so you would not be submitting a photo ID when you did that. And it would be a very cumbersome process at the election office, and so we would oppose that.
Deborah Wheeler, I speak in strong support for this. The absentee balloting without a photo ID is a huge loophole for people voting not their own ballot. In a recent Virginia election, when online absentee balloting first started, we have a record, and actually the candidate said before the State Board of Elections that the IPO address, which submitted over 1,000 requests for absentee ballots at 3 o'clock in the morning, came from his campaign headquarters. I've knocked a lot of doors. I've asked a lot of people to vote in my life, but I've never submitted 1,000, and I've never knocked a door at 3 o'clock in the morning. I think in order to secure the absentee voting, we need to know that indeed the person who is requesting an absentee ballot is the person who is going to mark that ballot and submit that ballot, so that we don't have people who are just names on a page submitting. When online request for absentee ballots and registration, specifically for registration, is linked to the DMV has a photo and puts the DMV number with that application. So there is some security and some knowledge that the person requesting is indeed the person who is going to get the absentee ballot. A photo ID would close that loop and secure the absentee ballots for everyone voting. I strongly support this bill. Thank you.
David Berkey, General Registrar for the City of Falls Church. The city had the highest turnout of absentee voting in the state in the presidential election at 25%. So I come here with some knowledge over how the actual implementation of this bill would affect us, and it would do more to discourage absentee voting by mail than it would do to protect any vote. I strongly oppose this bill.
Lawrence Sassett, General Registrar of Fairfax County. Without feigning that it is too much work, I believe that this would add a significant administrative burden on the process of actually accepting absentee applications and reviewing absentee ballots. Currently, Fairfax County is in position, it requires a significant amount of manpower to handle all the absentee ballot applications, and even more so on Election Day to actually process all those absentee ballots. So for that reason, we oppose this bill.
Tracy Howard, President of the Voter Registrars Association of Virginia, Registrar in the city of Radford. Not opposing the bill on its ideology. We're opposing it simply because of the administrative duties involved. Also, there is an ID that would be required with the absentee application and an ID that would be required to come back with the ballot. We feel like that may be a problem where no other voter is required to show ID twice. But it would be a significant administrative burden, and you have no one to compare that identification to.
Bill Jenkins, Sussex County Registrar. We already have the HAVA law, which the first-time voters must show the ID. So I am regularly used to having to ask those first-time voters to mail in that. Since a lot of students and people are using email or text, I have no problem getting this. I mean, just because I don't believe you should be passing something. This is an excellent bill. I support it. I don't want to hear that I'm a little bit too busy to be accurate. I want accurate. Absentee should be the exception, not the rule. Thank you.
Questions for the patron from the committee?
Madam Chairman, just wanted to ask council a question. This bill is different than the one that we passed last year because it has a photo ID just to ask for an absentee ballot. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, last year's bill only required the ID or a copy of the ID be submitted with the application, and this one went a step further to require that it also submit one for or with the ballot itself.
So, but we still have a problem that when you come in, get it. There's still no when you vote absentee. The registrar is not going to know, even though you send a picture. We don't have a national ID database. I mean, there's several people in the audience who thinks we should have one, like Mexico and Brazil. I think that was a big policy choice we made not to do that, not to have a national ID, but we don't have one. So, who are they going to compare the picture to? And they get when a picture comes in with the ballot. I think that's a problem. Maybe that's a rhetorical question. You can't answer. They just don't have one. So I think this bill has a lot of problems, just like last year's bill. Military and overseas voters, correct?
I'll respond, and council can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's just the military overseas ballot, and/or it's also to include the spouse if they were overseas as well. Is that correct, Meg?
That's correct, and also persons with disabilities would be exempt from the requirement.
I respectfully ask this question. How are you going to determine who has a disability and who does not have a disability?
Can you?
That's currently a reason that a person could apply for an absentee ballot, so the process would be the same for that. Perhaps a registrar might be able to speak to what they actually do to verify that.
This legislation doesn't change that requirement or doesn't affect that. That's existing law. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Delegate Cole, that is correct.
I go back to my question: how do you determine whether someone has a disability or not? If you're taking they're exempt because of a disability, how do you determine that?
Is that germane to the discussion of the bill? Probably a call for the chair to make. I mean, it's, so what we're talking about is photo ID. And that, I guess that would be up to the registrars. I mean, it's not what we're talking about.
Summary of the bill, and it says, person with a disability taking a photo ID. Photo ID is from probably a headshot.
But it's already existing law.
Report this. I think it probably needs to come to the Appropriations Committee because it could have potential fiscal impact. What I'm hearing as far as maybe additional workload within the registrars to take a look at.
Move to report and refer to appropriations.
Okay, so we have a motion on the table to report and refer to appropriations. All those in favor of reporting and referring to appropriations, please respond by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
Appropriations. Okay, we're moving on to absentee. Delegate Yost, you are first on the list with House Bill 1912.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. This is House Bill 1912. This was an issue that was actually brought to me by one of my local registrars this past election. This expands the eligibility for those who are able to vote absentee to add protective orders, those who are under condition of a protective order. As everyone in this room is well aware, when you go to vote, you have to publicly state your name and your residential address loudly and clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear, including the elections officers. Many individuals, including this young lady who this happened to, use P.O. boxes for a measure of security to do business, so the residential address is not public. P.O. boxes are not acceptable when you're voting for that. You have to put your house address. So this would add a little bit of level of security and privacy for these individuals when they're trying to vote.
Chairman Tracy Howard, President of the Voter Registrars Association of Virginia. The association supports this bill, supports it very strongly. I'm familiar with the situation that happened in Giles County. Delegate Yost is my delegate. The registrar there called me, asked what I would do in this situation. This is just a good common sense bill.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
How do you know the person is under a protective order?
As with every other reason on the absentee ballot application, they're signing under penalty of perjury, essentially.
There is in this later part of the bill, it actually requires him to report the county or city under which the protective order is issued.
Madam Chairman, members, Carol Nog, I support this excuse for absentee voting, but I do have a question about how it would be there would be privacy when you fill out that application to vote absentee. You have to use your excuses. So is that going to be on there so that when they check in to vote, do they have to check that they have a protective order? Or is there another classification?
My understanding they would follow the way it is now. That would be just an added box under the other level excuses that you can already submit.
Madam Chair, I don't have any problem necessarily with this bill, but I thought there were limited cases where you could have a valid voter ID using the P.O. box. because this comes up in other situations. Over the years, I thought there was, or maybe it's some other area of law that required an address, but people that have a protective order, I think they can't, I thought they already could use their P.O. box.
I think that's in the voter list. I mean, Eduardo, do you know?
Chair, members of the committee, yes, currently voters are able to identify when they register to vote that they're under protected. We have different classes of protected voters, and so we generally provide their mailing address to the P.O. box as the registration address on the voter list and everything. I think the concern here is the physical safety of individuals when they go to the polling place, because you may know in a lot of these instances, people know generally where someone is staying, and by them showing up at the polling place, they have to subject themselves to that potential incident, which is what happened prior to this election. So this would just facilitate them not having to go in person to cast their ballot.
I would think this is going to have a fiscal impact since you're going to have to, if it passes, you're going to have to modify the absentee ballot forms. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, we have on tap for this year to reproduce additional, an additional issuance of the absentee application. So we would time our release as we have in the past with other changes, as long as the timing's right. And in this instance, we would do it over the summer in preparation for the November election. So we could just incorporate it into that print run and production.
I'd like to support this bill strongly, as the commissioner said, but just so everyone understands, when someone fills out a voter registration application, they must put their home residence address, but they can check a box that says that they are under a protective order or for other reason they're a fireman or a policeman, and then they check and put a post office box so that when they come to the polling place and announce their name for everyone to hear, they announce their post office box, which is what shows up in the poll book. The purpose of this bill is to protect this person from having to go to the precinct to help identify.
Ms. Wheeler, we've reported the bill. We're
Oh, I'm
about to
sorry.
vote on it.
I didn't get to vote yet.
We had a motion on the table
Yeah.
with a second. All of those in favor, please respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Delegate Carr, House Bill 1935.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is House Bill 1935, which has to do with the absentee voting. This bill would allow in-person, no excuse absentee voting for 21 days prior to an election. The start day would be the day after the voter registration deadline. A person voting absentee in person would follow the same process as he would on Election Day. Upon arriving at his registrar's office, the absentee voter would provide a valid ID and use the printed election